Okay. Okay. Welcome. Well, this is a fantastic turnout, so thank you very much for coming. And I do apologise to those of you who are in the spill-out room, which is a measure of success for our book this evening. First of all, I'll say who I am. I'm Beverley Skeggs from the Atlantic Fellows for Social and Economic Equity programme, which is within the International Inequalities Institute. And we're putting that up now because we're about to recruit for next year. It's all live. We are recruiting. There's going to be a webinar very soon. And I'd like to welcome this year's fellows who I see dotted around in this theatre to the LSE for the first time for one of these really large lectures. So tonight's lecture is the absolute opposite topic for the Inequalities Institute because it gives us the bigger picture and it moves between the structural analysis of the large global picture into the very intimate and personal. It's a perfect example of what inequalities research should be doing. It shows how the lives of people are affected by these horrific inequalities. And it shows the differences between different countries. Tonight we'll discuss the new book, and we'll see that in a minute, which is The Inner Level, which is how more equal societies reduce stress, restore sanity, and improve everyone's well-being. It follows on from the very successful, if you haven't read it, you should, absolute classic now, The Spirit Level, which is why inequality is better for everyone, but I noticed that they changed the subtitle at one point as well. So we have really creative subtitles, but basically the message is the same. Inequality is really bad for everyone, even the 1% who manage to benefit at the moment grossly, whilst others are still suffering. So inequality is bad, is the message, but it takes different forms, and that's what we're going to look at. To my left, we have Professor Kate Pickett and Professor Richard Wilkinson, who've been working on these topics for some time now at the University of York. They're both social epidemiologists, where Kate is also the university champion for justice and equality. They also both founded the Equality Trust, which is a site that pulls together lots of reports, a really, really good website that will tell you what's happening around the country and will draw your attention to particular issues. So the hashtag for the event will be LSE Inequalities, and we'll see that in a minute. But please put your phones on silent. This is because tonight's event will be recorded and will be made available usually in a couple of weeks as a podcast, subject to no technical difficulties. We know we've got a lot of people watching internationally, so please keep your phones on silent. Kate and Richard are going to speak for 50 minutes, then we'll open out for 30 minutes of questions. And do please raise your hand because we will have people running around with microphones to make sure that you get a chance to answer a question. To warn you that we can't always get everybody in and it's always a disappointment and we have to kind of push you out at the end. So be prepared. But also to say that Kate will be signing copies of the book outside after the lecture. So without ado, I'd like to say welcome. Thank you so much for coming to introduce this book. If you could give them a great round of applause.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you all for coming. It's an honor to have such a good turnout. We're very pleased. I want to take you through, although you've just been told we were dealing with, we were going to talk about a new book, I want to talk about our old book first. Where is the clicker?
That's going to help you.
No clicker.
Yeah, the clicker was here.
Right, good, thank you. Okay. I want to really put our spirit level book in context. I think many people read it. They didn't know the background literature and thought that all there was to our case was a set of cross-sectional correlations. And in an audience like this, I want really to tell you it's much more than that. But first I want to suggest that it's relevant to a sort of social malaise in our society, that the levels of inequality and the effects we're talking about this evening are fundamentally important to... these pictures, the bottom one is a photo taken outside Oxford Street tube station. You can see every face there is miserable, haggard, anxious, depressed. They look as if they're going to have nervous breakdowns. And yet we all pose like that, like the top picture, as if life is wonderful. And I'm not on Facebook, but I know if you read people's Facebook things, it sounds as if our lives fit those top pictures, the top picture. But the bottom one actually tells us quite a lot about the truth. This Mental Health Foundation survey a few months ago really provides some of the data that backs up that picture. Really, that 3/4 of adults felt so stressed or overwhelmed that they felt unable to cope sometime in the past year. And almost 1/3 of adults had suicidal feelings as a result of stress in the last year. And not in the last year, but in their lifetime, 16% of adults had self-harmed as a result of stress. And of course, self-harm has been rising, so the figures will be higher than that. And, you know, our societies are meant to be at the peak of well-being. Higher standards of material wealth and so on than ever before. And yet, something fundamentally different is going on, fundamentally important. So bear that in mind as we talk. It seems to me that there are two very different views of inequality. The popular view, I think, is a pretty naive view. It's the idea that inequality only matters if it creates poverty. But actually, much nearer the truth is what it does to feelings of superiority and inferiority, dominance and subordination, how it links up with our sensitivities to social status and how we're seen and how we're judged. And it's really the psychological effects of inequality that we've covered in our most recent book, The Inner Level, that came out in June, I think. What we're going to show you is basically rather a lot of graphs looking like that with different problems up the side. When I found, I'm sure you people, when you have to give a lecture, you go and look at Google Images. That's where this comes from. I felt really pleased. Somebody's understood, even if it was only one person. I think that though, when we go through the range of problems that we showed were correlated, at least cross-sectionally, internationally, with inequality, people are astonished by the range of things. I mean, much higher rates of school bullying in more unequal countries, much higher homicide rates, more people in prison, weaker community life, weaker levels of trust. Drug abuse goes up, infant mortality goes up, life expectancy, mental illness, obesity, all more common in more unequal societies, by which simply I mean bigger income differences between rich and poor. And then some things we've classified as human capital, child well-being, high school dropout rates from US data, maths and literacy scores, social mobility and teenage birth rates. People look at those and say, how can income inequality affect all these outcomes? They all have one important factor in common. They all have social gradients. They're all more common at the bottom of the social hierarchy. And it's these problems which get worse in societies which have those bigger income differences. So in a way, all we're saying is something extraordinarily simple. that problems we know are related to social status within our societies get worse when you increase the social status differences. And it really is extraordinarily simple, and it shouldn't have been something that was a sort of new idea. We should always have known about this. We've always known that endless problems are more common at the bottom of society. The other thing is that people took our work, which was really an attempt to get a picture that had been developing in the academic literature, out into the public arena. So, you know, we were trying to show the data, the effects of inequality in the simplest possible ways. So we chose countries where GNP per capita no longer matters very much, the rich developed countries, so we didn't have to use complicated, well, statistics people would find complicated, controlling for GNP per capita. But basically, in the academic literature, the first papers showing that inequality was damaging to health and led to increases in violence came out in the 1970s. There are now over 300 papers looking at these issues in the journals. And people have controlled for just about everything under the sun. They've controlled for levels of education. There are multi-level models. There are meta-analyses of multi-level models of cohorts aging over time. We know quite a lot about the causal orderings and beginning to understand the lag times better. We actually, when we realized that it was problems with social gradients that got worse in more unequal societies, we did a formal test of that. We looked at different causes of death, some that have steep social gradients, you know, like heart disease and respiratory disease, and others that have little or no social gradient, like breast cancer or prostate cancer. And sure enough, you found the steeper their social gradient, the stronger their relationship with inequality for the whole society. So it is basically a very simple picture that we've been trying to bring people's attention to. I want now to convince you that this is about sensitivity to social status. We are not evolved to be sensitive to whether or not we have the latest iPhone. We are evolved to be sensitive to our social position in the social hierarchy. I want to read you a quote from a study by, I can't remember whether it is Robin or Robert Walker at Oxford, a paper from the Journal of Social Policy a few years ago. They interviewed people in poverty, regarded as in poverty, in a number of different societies. In Uganda, in India, China, Pakistan, Korea, the United Kingdom, and Norway. And of course, poverty means totally different things in material terms in those different societies. And in India, I guess it meant living in a shack with an earth floor and no proper drainage or water supply. In Norway, it means living probably in a 3-bedroom flat with central heating and a flat-screen television. And yet, what they found when they interviewed poor people was the experience of poverty, despite those material differences, were extraordinarily different. I'll just read you some of their conclusions. They say respondents universally despised poverty and frequently despised themselves for being poor. Parents were often despised by their children, women despised their menfolk, and some men were reported to take out their self-loathing on their partners and children. Despite respondents generally believing that they had done their best against all odds, they mostly considered that they had both failed themselves by being poor and that others saw them as failures. This internalization of shame was further externally reinforced in the family, the workplace, and in their dealings with officialdom. Even children couldn't escape this shaming, for with the possible exception of Pakistan, school was an engine of social grading, a place of humiliation for those without the possessions that guaranteed social acceptance. No parent was able to escape the shame of failing to provide for their children, even when children were prepared to stop asking for things. For men, relying on others or on welfare benefits was perceived as a challenge to their sense of masculinity. A British father to 2 children admitted, "I feel like shit. I'm meant to be the man in this relationship. I'm to take care of the missus and my kids, and I don't." So it's that awareness, that the psychological effects of being in an inferior social position that I think is close to the heart of the relationships we've been drawing attention to. I think it's important to recognize that when drawing attention to the important causal effects of income distribution, that we're not talking about something quite separate from class and status. We're talking about, if you like, a modifier of class and status, that bigger material differences between us lead to bigger social status differences, bigger social distances, if you like. And increasingly, we believe that bigger income differences make class and status more important, more powerful in the way they influence our lives. But also more important in the way we judge each other. I want now to just give you, before Kate takes over, we're going to do roughly half each, a sort of nugget of an idea of the damaging effect, what inequality does to social relationships. And I think that is the heart of it. There are a number of studies that show that involvement in community life, civic participation, involvement in local groups, membership of voluntary associations and so on, is lower in more unequal societies. We also know that levels of trust are lower. I should say, all these relationships we've shown and other people have shown in other settings, not only just amongst this bunch of countries, but amongst the American states, 50 American states, for instance, very similar pictures. There are also papers that show that people are less willing to help each other in more unequal societies, less willing to help the disabled, the elderly, and so on. So you start to lose that sort of sense of reciprocity, the involvement with each other, willingness to help each other. And now very well attested in the research is the rise in violence as measured by homicide rates. This is the work of Martin Daly and Margot Wilson. The red dots are American states, the blue triangles are Canadian provinces. And you see there are something like tenfold differences. You've got about 15 homicides per million there, and it goes up to 150. When we talk to American audiences, they often suggest that it's to do with ethnic divisions, and they see all the problems with social gradients as really most common in the African American communities. And when that suggestion was raised as a criticism of Daly and Wilson's work, their response was to look at the perpetrators, white perpetrators of homicide, i.e. white murderers, and measure inequality just amongst the white population. The relationship is almost unchanged. So this isn't something that is a proxy for something like ethnic divisions. However, if you move towards much more unequal societies than the societies we've been showing you here, more unequal societies than Britain and the United States, you see these processes have gone a stage further. We've given some lectures in Mexico. We went to Cuernavaca, and house after house has bars on the windows, bars on the doors, razor wire around fences around their yards. And you can see people are frightened of each other in those countries with very high income differences. And the same in South Africa. I'm sorry, this is a blurred picture. That's an electric fence along the top, and this notice, if it wasn't so blurred, you could read, it says armed response. If you're caught climbing in, you might get shot. What I find really remarkable, though, is that that sort of suggestion I've given you of a transition from societies where people are involved with each other, where there is a bit of give and take reciprocity, to these societies where people are afraid of each other, don't trust each other, much higher levels of violence. That picture is confirmed by an extraordinarily different kind of data. This comes from Bowles and Jayadef, two American economists. They've shown these relationships internationally and for American states. As before, you have inequality along the bottom, the more unequal societies that end. And the proportion of the labor force in each country involved in what they call guard labor, security staff, police, prison officers, basically the people we use to protect ourselves from each other. That increases with inequality. And that seems to me to show exactly what I was suggesting, that the series of slides I've just shown you tells us about the damage to the quality of social relationships in a society. And what I think is perhaps worst about it is, of course, the studies of health and happiness increasingly show that our well-being depends on the quality of social relationships. Friendship is hugely protective of health. In terms of survival rates after an initial baseline measurements, it really matters whether people have good friendships, whether they have many friends and so on. After you've taken account of initial levels of illness. It's not, whether people have friends or not is at least as important as whether or not they smoke to survival over follow-up periods. And of course the studies of happiness show, again, the quality of your relationships, the number of your friends, whether you're involved in community life, is crucially important to the quality of all our lives. So it's there that inequality really strikes, at those issues to do with the quality of our relationships. I think why we have become so sensitive to these issues in a way, and it came as a great surprise. Kate and I, our background was in trying to understand health inequalities, the big class differences in death rates. And I think everyone in the field was very surprised that things like social status seemed important, low social status damaging, bigger status differences damaging, and friendship, as I've said, so beneficial. But basically, those are the two opposite ways in which we can come together. As members of the same species, we all have the same needs. I can fight you for everything that we both want, both need. Whether it's food, nesting sites, whatever it is, sexual partners, there's also always this potential for conflict among members of any of the same species. But the opposite way of dealing with that is to recognize each other's need, to cooperate. And that has been always so important to human welfare that we have developed this extraordinary sensitivity to friendship, and we know about social strategies to maintain friendship. We also know about dominant strategies. We see it embedded in the language, words like companion, combine, con and pan. Our friends are the people we share resources with. And even in the sort of religious symbolism of the communion service in Catholicism, there's that idea of sharing as being, and it crops up in other forms, of course, in other world religions. I do think that this statement of Marshall Salin's who I think is a wonderful anthropologist. I haven't met him, I'd love to. He said he's really spent his life studying hunting and gathering societies based on food sharing, on gift exchange, extraordinarily egalitarian societies, which covered 90% of our existence as human beings. He said gifts make friends and friends make gifts. The gift is the symbol that I recognize your need. I'm not going to fight you for access. And your sense perhaps of indebtedness, which some psychologists say is universal, he says creates the basic social compact between us. So I think at the most fundamental level, perhaps that's what we're dealing with. Now I'm going to leave it to Kate to take over and tell you about particularly about our more recent work. You can, yes, shall I put it on?
Oh, you got a clap. That's fine, that's fine. Thank you, thank you. Hi, everybody. You know how Richard said that friendship was as good for your health as smoking is bad for it? Public speaking is probably the most stressful thing and worst thing for your health that anybody can do. And he's got through his bit, but it's my turn now. You will see my status anxiety exhibiting itself. Earlier on, Richard put up that very, very simple, lovely image that just said problems, inequality, they're related. I'm going to show you lots of graphs like that, I'm afraid. But if you understood that one, you will get all of these. This one is from our earlier book, and we created an index of health and social problems that had all of the kinds of things in it that Richard was talking about earlier. Health, things like life expectancy, infant mortality, obesity, and mental illness. It had things to do with human capital development, like social mobility and teenage pregnancy and educational measures. And it had things to do with social functioning, like trust and imprisonment and violence. And we found that it was so strongly related to inequality that we had to sort of try and understand why that was. So the key messages from that first book, which we published about a decade ago, it took us a year to write, and it's taken us 10 years to write the second one, was that lots of things are affected by inequality. The differences between different societies are really large. They're much too large to be explained by the number of people in poverty in different countries. And the other key message was that we're all affected by inequality. So it's not just a difference between the poor and the rest of us. We're all affected by inequality. We found that this was true if we looked at other people's indexes of health and well-being. So this is the UNICEF Index of Child Well-being, which was first published in 2007. The UK came absolute bottom for child well-being in 2007. We're doing a little bit better now in this more recent one from 2015. But this index of child well-being has about 40 different things in it. It's whether kids are vaccinated, whether they get on with their peers, whether they can talk to their parents, whether they eat their fruits and vegetables, whether they have books at home, etc. So whether we create our own index or look at somebody else's index, we find this strong association with income inequality. And actually in this same paper, we looked at changes in income inequality over a 10-year period and changes in the UNICEF Index of Child Well-being. And those countries that had become more unequal saw a deterioration in their child well-being, just as we would expect, and those that had become a little bit more equal did better. Lots of people think that it's okay to have some level of inequality because we live in a meritocracy, and those who are clever, work hard, they'll rise up. The stupid and the lazy will move down, and so inequality is okay because we live in a meritocracy and it rewards effort and capability. This isn't true. You can't have equality of opportunity if you haven't got equality of outcome. Here we're looking at social mobility, and you can see it's much higher in the more equal societies and much lower in the more unequal societies. So if you want to experience the American dream, then you should go and live in Denmark or possibly Finland. You can't have it here. And so this idea that we've got this sort of sorting system and, everybody meretricious moves up and everybody who's not worth much moves down, it's a bit bonkers. Politicians across the political spectrum will say that they think equality of opportunity is a good idea. Not enough of them recognise that to have that, you need to have greater equality of outcomes. So here's mental illness in relation to income inequality. This comes from our Spirit Level book from 10 years ago, but really it's the starting point for our new book. So what we're looking at here is the prevalence of mental illness in rich, developed countries. People used to think you couldn't compare levels of mental illness in different countries because they would be affected by treatment, culture, health services, that kind of thing. But the World Health Organization wanted to understand whether or not there were differences in mental illness in different countries. So they did population-based surveys of large random samples of the adult population, and they asked them questions about symptoms. So they didn't say, have you been diagnosed with depression or anxiety or whatever? Have you been treated for mental illness? They asked about your appetite and your sleep patterns and your worries, that kind of thing. And they can classify people into different mental illness groups. So that's where these data come from, those kinds of surveys. Strong relationship with income inequality, even though we don't have that many countries for which we have those surveys. So in the more equal societies, around 10% of the population have had some kind of mental illness in the past year. But for us, here in the UK, with these measures, it was 23%. And for the US, it was 26%, so more than 1 in 4. And think of those statistics that Richard showed you a little bit earlier, about 3/4 of us feeling so stressed in the past year that we feel like we cannot cope. When we published this in the British Journal of Psychiatry, a psychiatrist wrote in and said, this is pathologizing normal feelings. We're diagnosing too many people. How can Wilkinson and Pickett actually believe that 23% of us have had a mental illness in the past year? So I sort of thought about friends, family, colleagues, way more than 23%. And anyway, it was sort of missing the point, because the point isn't really, is 23% the right number for the UK? The point is, why is the UK on the same measures that we're doing everywhere else so much higher than all of these other countries? Why have we got such a high level of distress in our population, that's affecting our young people to the degree that 1/4 of them are self-harming at the age of 14? Why is our suicide rate going up? Why are we having so many of these problems? And do you remember after we published the Spirit Level, we went to America and did the tour when the book came out there, and we went back to a university where I'd worked for 4 years, the University of Chicago, which is a little bit snooty. It's a bit like Oxford, Cambridge, and dare I say it, possibly even the LSE. So it's one of those places where they think they're really top notch. And when you give a talk at the University of Chicago, if you get through 3 PowerPoint slides before they start slamming into you, you've done really, really well. So we went there, and they're all people I know, and I said, could you please be really kind to me, because I've been away for 4 years and I've forgotten how to cope with you. Like, no. And we showed them all of our work, didn't we? And at the end, we were talking about our hypothesis that anxieties about status were underpinning all of the relationships we'd shown them between inequality and health and social problems. And at the end, they said, well, that's all very well, but you haven't shown us that. And they were right. We were making inferences, we were thinking that that was the reason, but nobody had shown it. And now they have. And what's really nice is that it wasn't us. I mean, that's the good thing, isn't it? Somebody else has shown that. So this paper from Richard Late and Christopher Whelan in Ireland looked at anxieties about status, people's worries about their status in 28 different European countries. Some high inequality countries, that's the top line, medium inequality, bottom line, low inequality, the very bottom line. And they looked at anxieties about status among those who were in the poorest tenth of the population, all the way through the income distribution to the richest tenth. If you're poor, wherever you live, of course, you worry more about your status. But if you live in an unequal society, everybody worries about it more. And so this is sort of the real starting point for our new book, is trying to sort of see what does that do to us? What does that do to the way we think, the way we feel, the way we behave, the way we interact? And what we find is that, of course, it affects us all profoundly. We were really, I think, very deeply impressed by research conducted by Sherry Johnson, a neuropsychologist or biologist from California, who looked at what's called the dominance behavioral system. And this is a system that we have as humans, animals have it as well. It's how we react physiologically, hormonally, emotionally, behaviorally to issues of subordination and dominance. You know, if we feel that we're encountering somebody else who views us as inferior, or we view them as inferior, how we react. And she found all kinds of markers of mental illness related to the dominance behavioral system. So that if people felt more inferior, they were more likely to be depressed and anxious. If people were trying to assert their superiority, they were more likely to be narcissistic or psychotic. But she didn't link these things to levels of inequality in society. But actually, all of the conditions that she showed are linked to the dominance behavioral system are linked to inequality as well. So we see two different kinds of response to inequality. The first is to accept your inferiority, to worry about your status, and become depressed and anxious. We see more depression in more unequal societies, and this is just one graph that shows that. We see more anxiety. But we can also react a different way by exaggerating our self-importance, by bigging ourselves up, by thinking if status matters a huge amount, then I'd better put on a good face and say that I'm doing all right. This is a graph that shows that self-enhancement is higher in more unequal societies. And self-enhancement is a term that psychologists use to describe people thinking that they're better than they are, right? So you might know the story that most American drivers think they're better than average, right? 96% of Americans think they are a better driver than average. Okay? You're a sophisticated audience, you got that right away. Only 2/3 of Swedes think they're better than average, right? Still too much, it's still too great. And we're obviously never going to get to Michael Gove's all schools will be better than average kind of thing. But this is psychologists asking people, random samples of the adult population in different countries, do you think you're a better driver than other people? Do you think you're better looking than other people? Are you a nicer person? Are you more intelligent? Etc. And people are much more likely to self-enhance if they live in a more unequal society. So this is the other kind of response to anxieties about status. You can get depressed, you can go under, or you can kind of fight against it and try and claw your way up. And because of this, we see narcissism rising over time In the United States, these are data from Jean Twenge, psychologist from California, and we've plotted them against income inequality rises over the same time period. And I would recommend her work to you. She's written a book called The Narcissism Epidemic, and I think it's really important to actually understand the impact that this kind of self-enhancement is having in society. It's got lots of funny stories in it. It's got stories about the high school student who wanted her road closed and red carpet laid down so she could go to her prom. The story of the bride who had her wedding cake baked in the shape of herself. And, thank you for reminding me, you can hire fake paparazzi to follow you around, right? So, you go out on the town and they come out and they follow me going, Kate, come on, show us your legs. Fake paparazzi. But jokes aside, narcissism isn't really that funny. So people with narcissistic tendencies, personalities, traits, disorders cause huge problems for their families, for their friends, for their colleagues. And if you take a moment to think about how awful it would be if a narcissist rose to a position of power in a major country in this world. Bad one, really. Schizophrenia too. Schizophrenia is more common in more unequal societies. Psychotic symptoms are more common in more unequal societies. Delusions of grandeur are a huge part of lots of people's psychosis. Inequality matters, right? So it makes some of us go under, it makes some of us strive upwards. Lots of us just try to cope with it through mechanisms that give us comfort. So we see more comfort eating, more calorie intake. In more unequal societies, we see more drug and alcohol use. We see more gambling, more problem gambling. This isn't just having a flutter on the Grand National, which we do every year in our village sweepstake. We won it twice running, and that made me think I'd got some special insight. So I tried it online the following year. Rubbish, it's rubbish. This is problem gambling. You see higher levels of problem gambling in more unequal societies. And so we also see people trying to increase their status through what they buy. It is how we show other people that we're worth something, right? So if you have second-class, third-class goods, you're a second-class, third-class person, right? If you have things that other people want, things that show your status, bigger car, bigger house, designer labels, etc., that's how you cope. And so we see higher levels of consumerism and overconsumption, status consumption in more unequal societies. We've got academic studies now looking at different countries, different US states, and showing that status consumption is higher in more unequal societies. If you want to have a go yourselves and show your worth a lot, get yourself a Louis Vuitton rubbish bag and put your rubbish out in a designer trash bag. If those are a little bit unaffordable, you can just go on eBay and you can buy other people's used designer carrier bags, and then you can go out on the high street, buy whatever you want, and put it in your Gucci paper bag. But obviously, if we're starting to think about how we move to sustainable economies, how we move towards economies that don't focus on endless growth, that focus on well-being instead, we are going to have to rein in this tendency, this idea that the things we own show people how important we are. We can't make that transition towards sustainability if we allow status consumption and over-consuming to sort of carry on running rampant. There's more advertising in more unequal countries, which I think underpins what I've just showed you. And therefore, of course, there are higher levels of debt. This is income inequality and household debt over time in the United States. Debt is a huge issue for us here in the UK. British levels of debt are phenomenally bad. And debt is one of the worst things you can have for sort of mental health, well-being, for children as well as adults. In households where people are in debt, everybody's worried, nobody's sleeping well, everybody's anxious, everybody's depressed. We thought we should put up a couple of peer-reviewed papers for those of you who'd like to sort of learn a little bit more. The top one is a causal review of all of the studies of income inequality and health. And the bottom one is more of a sort of theoretical look at the impact of inequality. If you can't find them, drop us an email and we will send them to you. So I think we're going to stop there. We did think, and we often spend time towards the end of a talk talking about solutions. What can we do to fix this problem? What should we be doing to create more equal societies? But you know, we're not experts in that. We're epidemiologists. We understand the causes of health, disease, disorder, dysfunction. We've got those tools and we can think about those really well. When it comes to solutions, we've got some guesses and we've got some opinions, but they are just guesses and they are just opinions. And yours will be as good as ours. And when I've read reviews of our most recent book, what's been really nice is that nobody's questioning the science anymore. The science is really solid, guys. It's so robust. When Richard showed you that chart with all those different things affected by inequality, we were on the train coming down here, and I said, don't show them that. It's so out of date. The lists are so long. So many more things have been linked to inequality than they were 10 years ago. The science is extremely robust. We have longitudinal studies. You know, we just have loads and loads of stuff. But what we do about it, that's what people are arguing about at the moment. That's what they say. Well, I didn't like their inner level book because I don't agree with the solutions. Fine. That's fine. Come up with your own. It shouldn't be up to a couple of epidemiologists to write the charter for how we deal with inequality in this country. It should be up to government. It should be up to policymakers. It should be up to local government. It should be up to all of us as we vote and think. It's not up to us. So we'd really like to hear your ideas in the question and answer session about what we should do about all of this. Thanks. Thank you.
Okay, so I will open it out to questions straight away because I'm sure there's quite a lot. If you can raise your hands, and I need to make sure people have got the microphones out. So there's a hand over here. I'll go on this side first. So we'll take three at a time if that's okay with you. One, there, two, and then three.
Can I just say before we start the questions that I'm very deaf. So speak loudly, slowly, and clearly.
And I'll write it down.
Yes, please.
Thank you for a fascinating presentation. I'm really looking forward to reading the book. I was curious to know what you thought about the implications of your research for people on the upper end of the social hierarchy, because it seems like a lot of these problems are related to people who suffer from low status, but obviously correcting that requires some people to be brought down a peg, and as we've seen from the Senate hearings with Brett Kavanaugh, that doesn't always work out well. So I wondered if you had something to say about people on the upper end of the social hierarchy.
Okay, do you want to just pass the microphone back? That might be easier. Okay, yeah. I think it's 1, 2, 3 more rows back afterwards, if that's okay. And then I'll go in the middle.
Andrew and Kate, thanks a lot for your presentation. And Kate, I think your fear of public speaking is completely unfounded.
Yeah,
because this was quite amazing. In the spirit level, I was just looking at a chapter about mental illness and inequality, and there you kind of hint that the relationship between male mental illness and inequality is different or less clear compared to female mental illness and inequality. So I was just wondering, in your research for inner level, has that changed, or are there any kind of deeper insights on the difference between male and female mental illness and inequality? Thanks a lot.
Great. If you just, I think, Lauren? Yeah.
Hello, my name's Lauren Burke. I'm one of the Atlantic Fellows here. Thank you for coming and doing this amazing presentation. Your last point was that part of fixing this takes an increase in civic participation. How is inequality and the rise of mental illness and these social problems impacting civic participation and civic participation levels? It seems like we're on a reinforcing cycle here where the increase in inequality and the impacts on society also make it more difficult to fix those problems. So I'd be interested in your comments on that.
Okay. Are you ready with us?
I'll start,
Yeah.
and you do the next. The rich, the upper end of the income distribution, people often ask us what we should do about that, and we have to remember we live in a democracy, or what's meant to be a democracy, and if it is really about the 1% and the 99%, or 10% and the 90%, democracy ought to be able to make that it possible to get change. If you look at the long-term trends in income distribution in the 20th century, they start to fall from somewhere around the 1930s and we'd continue to get more equal in most developed countries until sometime in the late 1970s. And then you get the modern rise of inequality. And that, I think, is a reflection of the power of the labour movement, social democratic parties, the fear of communism, but it tells us something about the scale of the movement, the sustained social movement you have to have, and an idea that society can work differently to really make changes. But I also think the book by Anthony Appiah, The Honour Code, who goes through examples of social practices that have changed historically, and he says in each case it was because they ceased to be sources of respect and esteem and status. And so if we can make the rich feel they're not respected for taking all they can get, but are regarded as antisocial and greedy, that might help. Already there are occasional news stories about some CEOs not taking quite as much as they could.
But it is quite a difficult idea to get hold of.
Oh, no, these ones work here.
I think.
Okay.
The idea that the rich are affected by inequality as well as the poor. They're not affected as much, but they are affected. And I think that's quite a tough idea
No, we don't know about the super
for people to grasp. No, but we know about the top 10% or the top 20%. We went on the Today programme just after the Inner Level was published, and I told John Humphries that even with his very, very high salary, which we all know about, don't we? He would be more likely to live longer, have better mental health, his children do better in a more unequal society.
More equal society.
In a more equal society. And he found that quite hard to think about. And I used to think that all we had to do was show people, all we had to do was show them the evidence that, even at the top, you're more likely to not do well. And I've had a PhD student looking at 5-year-old children's life chances in more equal and less equal countries, and showing that, even those of them in families with the highest income parents, the most educated parents, etc., they don't do as well as they would if they lived in a more equal country. And I used to think that kind of evidence would be enough to get those in power and those with high incomes and the most educated and the highest social class to recognise the damage that inequality is doing to them. I wasn't right. It's going to take a lot more than that, but I do think it's an important first step, and we do have that evidence. So that is an important first thing, isn't it?
Sex differences.
Oh, the mental illness thing. Yeah, really good question. So when we were writing the Spirit level and we wanted to do comparative studies of mental illness, comparing different societies, we'd got the World Health Organization surveys that I showed you for different countries, but all we had for the United States, for the different US states, because we always tried to look at the 50 US states as well as the different rich countries as a different test bed, were data from a survey where people self-reported whether or not they had had mental illness in a time period. And we found that inequality was related to mental illness for children and women, but not for men. I think that was driven by the kinds of things I was showing you around self-enhancement, and people's willingness or not to say, I've been mentally ill, and I think it has been, in many societies, harder for men to admit to frailties, emotional frailties. The data we have now is much more robust, and it isn't showing those gender differences that we used to see. But we still don't have good international data on children's mental health. It's a real gap. So, I think we've got an epidemic of mental health problems in Western developed countries. And we're just starting to recognise it. We're just starting to think about how to deal with it. We still actually don't have great data to underpin our analyses of what needs to be done. It's a real gap. But things have moved on. So sorry, guys. I think you are all mentally affected by inequality.
Yeah, it's part of the picture that violence, and if you lose your job, if you get the sack or your partner leaves you for someone else, do you blame yourself or do you blame other people? Do you take it out on them or on yourself? And there's a tendency in some analyses for suicide and homicide to move inversely, and we do think that that inequality. Societies with greater inequality means you blame other people for everything, where the more equal societies, you're more likely to blame yourself. And I think this is there's a difference in the gender responses on that dimension. I would like to say about the civic participation, and we think that an important part of the decline in civic participation with inequality is that for many of us, social contact becomes an ordeal. And if you live in a society where some people are supremely important and others are regarded as almost worthless, then, we tend to judge each other more by status and feel more judged by status. So all those issues of self-worth and social comparisons become much more loaded. And Kate described, you can either withdraw, become depressed and so on, or you can big yourself up in response to your worries about how you're seen and judged.
I think there's been a bit of sort of public self-discovery in a way. It came about with things like the global financial crisis and with things like the MPs' expenses scandals. I think huge numbers of people in this country, in the United States and in other countries, didn't actually realise how rich some people were, how much they had exploited other people, how much they had extracted for themselves. I think that was a real shock to lots of people. And I think when you get a greater public awareness of that divide, then you start to get people feeling angry, isolated, left behind, abandoned. And why would they vote? Why would they vote for somebody who's going to spend thousands on a duck house?
The Motowns.
So I do think that's been a sort of shift in people's awareness. And the shift, the lack of awareness goes the other way as well. I do a lot of research in Bradford, which is the 5th largest city in the UK. It's very poor. And if you drive around Bradford, it looks old-fashioned. It looks poor. And if you go down south and if you drive around a city in the south, you don't see anything like that. And so if I'm in a city in the south, I think, how do people here know what life is like in those cities up north? How can they imagine what people's livelihoods are like, what the streets are like, what the housing's like, what the schools are like? I think we've got huge divides in this country, north-south divides, income divides, ethnic divides, and when people are separated from each other and can't understand each other's ways of being, then they don't have empathy.
I think that's
Empathy
really
doesn't
key.
cross that
I was
divide.
thinking about the research we did on the media and the kind of 30 years of concerted demonising of the working class of all its different varieties. So if they don't have any contact, they have no knowledge, and their only sources are really bad reality TV, which then the news takes up. You know, even the Today programme now is more like a reality TV programme to me, which is just condemnatory about those who've been impoverished over years. It seems to me, how would they have sympathy? Because I always thought that if you actually told people about inequality, they'd think it was horrific and they'd do something about it. But no.
Yes, part of our view of the effect of inequality is it increases all what I call the downward prejudices.
Yeah.
And so, you know, all the questions about self-worth become more powerful. All the little social awkwardnesses with our worries about how we're seen and judged. And those are so divisive.
So, any more questions? I'll go for the middle section now, okay? Where's the microphone? So if we start here and we'll take the first three going up. We'll go for the top later, don't worry. So one there, you, and then behind you, yeah.
Hi, is it okay if I ask you? Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Thanks for the talk. I was wondering, because your research really focuses on income inequality. I know, being Dutch myself, that for quite some countries, the level of income inequality is perhaps not very high, but wealth equality is. So most of the inequality stems from, for example, you know, the inheritance and those kind of systems. So just being curious, how would that change or affect the argument that you make?
That's great. And if you want to pass it back, I think it's about 1, 2, 3 rows back. Is that right?
Yeah. You're going to do it?
Thank you. Mine's a very simple question, really, following on with what you were saying about Bradford. Are there any graphs similar to the ones you've shown, but for individual cities in Britain rather than countries of the world?
And then if you want to just pass it behind you.
Cities,
Yeah.
Hi, good evening. Wonderful talk, I must say. I just want to ask, is it too simple just to break this down into the economic models these countries are pursuing? We've got Scandi socialism, where people are living in nirvana, seemingly. And the other end, we've got, you know, naked, bare capitalism bankrupting countries and the people being made to bail out the bankers, perversely, and the working class being the whipping boys for all that. Is it just down to the economic model? Keynesianism seemed to do us all right. We seem to have an understanding between government and people. We had the cradle to grave. We had people who were engaged in worthwhile jobs, might not be an economic sense a worthwhile job, but once a monetary value is placed on everyone's lives, that's when the economic inequality began. May the 3rd, 1979, not to mention any names. And, you know, your mates at the Chicago school have got a lot to answer for, perhaps.
My mates?
She wasn't in economics.
Say that loosely. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Do you want to take those?
Yeah, do you want to do the first one?
Okay, the wealth inequality. Ideally, I think we'd have an index, a weighted index that combined income and wealth inequalities. When we were doing this, and still I think there's less good internationally comparable data on wealth inequality, though people are working on it. I've seen one paper looking at health in relation to wealth inequality, and the relationship actually looks very like it does for income inequality. You know, I do think the fundamental thing is material distances between us. In a way, status and hierarchy, if you think of it in evolutionary terms, is about privileged access to scarce resources. You know, I do think that the material differences are pretty fundamental, and income is only part of it, obviously. Yeah, I might have a go at the third question too. Cities?
Cities?
You're going to do three.
Yeah.
Cities, there's been several papers, principally American data, looking at inequality within cities. It's a bit hard to judge how much the inequality in cities is simply a reflection of inequality in the states they're in, but certainly analyses using city data comes up with rather impressive results in relation to the social damage of inequality. But I think people often actually make a mistake and think this is all about face-to-face relationships. And so you should really be measuring inequality in face-to-face relationships in the local community. The issue is perhaps whether my neighbour has a better car than I do. The studies which look at measure inequality just within small areas are much less likely to show an association between any of these health and social problems and income inequality. And I think that is because a poor deprived area doesn't have it doesn't have poor health because of the inequality within it. It has poor health because it's deprived in relation to the rest of society. And your measures of inequality must take that into account. That's partly why I emphasize that, you know, it's not separate from class and status. I think it's a matter of whether we have a very steep social pyramid like that or a much shallower one. And in some mysterious way, we do all know where we fit into the social hierarchy, what our class is, and we find endless ways to express it in our clothing and aesthetic taste and 101 other ways.
All of our neighbours do have better cars than us.
Yeah.
They do, don't they? Yeah. And they get the weeds off their driveway. I think we're considered a bit difficult. We're the only Guardian readers in our village. And one time, a few years ago, maybe about 10 years ago, my son, who was young, put a Labour poster in the window when there was a general election coming up, and we were asked by a local farmer not to go into his wood anymore, across his land, weren't we?
It turned out not to be his wood.
It wasn't even his wood. Wasn't even his wood.
What did he think you were going to do?
I don't know. But
vote in the wood.
I don't know. But we've nicknamed him Farmer UKIP, haven't we? So on the issue of like Scandinavian versus sort of the Anglo-speaking world, I mean, clearly there are differences in the welfare regimes that different societies put in place. But every relationship we've shown you, you know, across those different countries, we show the same thing across the 50 US states as well. We've got studies from Latin America that, you know, look at different countries, their income inequality in relation to health, provinces of China, countries in Eastern Europe, and we just see the same pattern over and over. So I think it's too simplistic to think that it's about welfare regimes or culture. I think the income differences do matter, but I think there must be feedback loops between all of those things. If you have a more equal society, it's probably easier to get people to keep voting for progressive policies, taxes, etc., educational policy. But I think the income differences matter themselves, and it's not just a question of differences in cultural welfare regime. Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, there are very different ways, of course, in becoming a more equal society, whether you do it by reducing income differences before tax or through redistribution, and both of them seem to have the health and social benefits. But I think one shouldn't think of it just as economic models. Economic models are, I believe, driven by politics and ideology. And neoliberalism is an ideology that's spread everywhere from the late 70s, early 80s onwards. And, again and again in history, we've seen this sort of sweep internationally of ideologies, whether it's the 1848 revolutions or the radicalism of the 1960s or the conservatism, the neoliberalism from the 80s onwards. And I think that those are the battles we have to fight. But I do remember giving some lectures in Chile soon after the military government had fallen or been replaced. And we were talking about this sort of stuff. This was before we'd met.
Right.
I thought Kate might be thinking of it as me giving an inaccurate account of the last time we were in Chile together. But people said, "You've given us hope." And we didn't understand what they meant. And they said that after the military dictatorship, they'd been dictated to by the World Bank. And they felt what we'd done was showing there are choices within capitalism, or different forms of capitalism, if you like.
Okay, so over here, I'll work up. Or actually, that's and over there as well. You had your hand up early in the blue suit up there, and then I'll work back down. Oh, okay. Okay, I'll come over to that side next then.
Paul Hudson, I wanted to ask a couple of questions on the graphs. This is in part of Kate's
Can you
speech.
put your microphone?
Sorry, I beg your pardon. Paul Hudson. I just want to ask a couple of questions on two of the graphs. Right. Okay. I'm learning, you see. Even in old age, one's got to learn. There was one of the graphs concerning the well-being of children, and pertaining to an axis, the vertical axis, you said I think you said there are 27 components to it. So I wondered, in fact, how you aggregated it and how you determined, in fact, the weights to be given to the various components.
Okay.
And then on the second graph, which was concerned where you had interviews with people from different nationalities as to whether they felt depressed or not, I think it's a case that in some cultures, people are willing to discuss whether they feel depressed or not. Maybe there are questions of cognitive dissonance involved. A friend of mine in Germany, this is where I worked for 6 years of my academic life, she made some very interesting, and she lived actually in England as well for some years. She mentioned that British people are much more willing to discuss openly their mental or psychological problems, much more so than in Germany. And I wondered how you could control for that.
Yep. Okay, do you want to the man in the blue suit? I'll do both.
I wanted to ask, what role do you think schools, or perhaps more broadly educational policies, play in perpetuating inequalities, and what role you thought they might play in providing a solution? I ask in part because of your comment during your introduction of meritocracy not reducing inequality, and my feeling that meritocratic principles are probably at the heart of a lot of our approach to education.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, can we take it right to the back now, and then we'll come back down for the next round. And then I think that will be it.
Yeah, because we give really long answers.
Hello. As you can tell from my accent, I'm from the land of Trump. And currently we're, in the press for the Me Too movement and obviously Kavanaugh. So I was wondering what impact you think gender equality would do, at least in the US or everywhere, on the wage gap or equality, specifically in terms of active parents, reproductive rights, and overall Planned Parenthood.
Great, thank you. Okay, you okay with those?
Right, so I'll do the graph ones first. Child well-being, that index is created by UNICEF, not by us. It has varied slightly over the years, so they've published an index of child well-being in rich countries in 2007, in 2013 and last year. The components of it have shifted a bit over time, although there's usually, some core ones that stay in, and they weight everything equally. All factors in there are weighted equally. And I know the people who developed it, and I've had conversations with them, and their justification for weighting everything equally is they don't know how to weight them differently. They're not sure what is more important for child well-being than others, so they do it that way. I think it's defensible, but you could also argue with it.
One of the components actually is the proportion of children in relative poverty in each society.
Yeah, so we take that out.
Because it would be rather a circular argument to show that relative poverty is...
Yeah. So, some people say, well, it contains things that are the causes of poor child well-being, as well as metrics that are about the outcome of child well-being. But it's somebody else's measure, that one. On the depression, so the graph we showed on mental illness isn't people saying they're depressed or not. It's from surveys that ask about symptoms. So it's not your willingness. And so it can't be, it's not susceptible to cultural differences in people's willingness to say they're mentally unwell. Maybe there are cultural differences in people's willingness to say that they don't feel hungry much, or they felt they didn't sleep well last night, or whatever, I don't know. But the measures are trying to overcome that. And the depression one we showed was for US states. So there shouldn't be cultural differences, I would have thought, between the states in people's willingness to admit that they're depressed. Shall I do the schools one, or do you want to?
Yeah, and just to let me add to what you said, and these problems in a way are less serious because some of the differences we show in the graphs are huge. So, the homicide one I showed you, there were tenfold differences. The same, similarly with infant mortality, teenage birth rates, also in the proportion of the population in prison. A number of things have these huge differences related to inequality. And I think none of them are smaller than 2- or 3-fold differences. So, if they're all very close, if the scores were all very similar, I'd be more worried that it was simply a reflection of cultural bias of some kind.
Shall I do schools?
Yeah.
Right, so I could talk for hours about schools.
Yeah, meritocracy.
Sorry, we're talking for hours about everything, aren't we? Schools. If we expect our schools to fix the structural problems of deprivation, austerity, poverty and inequality, which is balmy, they cannot. They cannot do it. Teachers can't do it. We know that we have big differences in cognitive development and social and emotional development among children way before they ever get to school. In the very, very, very early years of life, probably pregnancy, etc., etc. So expecting schools to fix that is bonkers. Expecting an education system to fix that, that is based on valuing one kind of achievement so much more than any other. We really value a kind of cognition I'm good at, so I've been really lucky, but we don't value emotional intelligence in the same way. We don't value other kinds of contributions. We've got an unequal system staffed by teachers who are not trained to think reflexively about what the classroom is like, where their children are coming from in the ways they used to be. I just don't think it can do it. Schools can help, early childhood education can help.
You can also make it worse.
Mostly they make it worse. Finland did it differently. Finland in the 1970s decided to have a big national conversation about their poor educational attainment, made all of their schools public, trained teachers better, paid them more, saw their educational attainment rise. We don't even seem willing to think about those kinds of things. And no, I think schools, as Richard said, often make things worse, but expecting them to make things better is sort of unfair.
I think it's also really important to remember the huge step change in inequality that happened in the 1980s in Britain was not a change in educational policy. It came from other sources that we've briefly mentioned.
Okay,
Did you? Oh, there's one more. About women.
Oh.
So we'll let Richard answer that one.
I think all the other dimensions of inequality, whether it's gender or sexual orientation or race or class, they're not such completely different things. You know, when anything becomes a marker of low social status, whether it's skin color or the religious, your religious affiliation, or what language group you belong to in some societies, or your gender, when they become markers of low social status, they attract all this very similar prejudices, the kind of processes we've been talking about. And you know, poverty wouldn't be a much nicer experience if you knew that representative numbers of black and white men and women, Protestants and Catholics, were poor. What we have to do is deal with the problem of poverty and inequality, and these things are all linked. The position of women, their pay disadvantage, is bigger in more unequal countries for fairly obvious reasons.
And of course the question was also about rights. I mean, the link between human rights and social justice and our research, you know, it's quite deep and it's clearly there. But in a way it isn't necessary. You can make arguments for greater equality from a rights perspective or a social justice perspective without any of the data we've shown you. You know, you could make a philosophical, ideological argument for justice and rights and equality. But I think our data help.
Can I make one more point on borrowed time?
yes.
And the education question, you know, the idea that we are meritocracy and your genetic endowment of ability affects where you end up, and the meritocracy is a reflection of these natural differences in ability. We have a chapter taking that to pieces, looking at how even if there are small environmental differences in many different kinds of abilities, they get enhanced, amplified by the kind of environment you choose. So, you know, if you're genetically a bit better at ball games, then you start enjoying it more. You get selected for the school team, you practice more, and so on, and you end up much better at ball games than people who thought they were bad at it. And the same with endless other abilities. And I think we make a fairly good case that actually the main differences in ability are not the determinant of position in the hierarchy, but position in the hierarchy is more a determinant of differences in ability.
I'm afraid I will cut you off at that point, but to say, before we thank Kate and Richard, that in the book there is a particular chapter on meritocracy, which includes all the other myths in terms of inequity that we live through, including delusions of grandeur, which I think is very important. So I'd like to say a huge thanks